Hey, hope your day or night's going well. Let's talk about Quake 2. So I was originally going to use the Steam version with a source port for this video, but as I was getting that ready, the good folks at Night Dive decided to just release an official remaster of it during QuakeCon. I knew there was a lot of rumors and speculation that Quake 2 was going to get remastered, but I never believed those because I just simply didn't think that Quake 2 was a game that would ever get that kind of treatment, given its reception over the years. So in this video, I want to take a look at that remaster to see what's been updated or added, and I'll also take a look back at Quake 2 as a whole. So this was handled by the same people that made the Quake 1 remaster back in QuakeCon of 2021. It was an excellent version of that game that featured improved visuals, audio, both original mission packs, as well as the mission pack made by Machine Games for the 20th anniversary of Quake. It also had a brand new mission pack made exclusively for that remaster, as well as full online and split-screen multiplayer / co-op. They even added a horde mode to it a couple months after it came out. That game was $10 and represents one of the best, most consumer-friendly remasters of an old game ever thanks to the sheer value it provides alone. Almost exactly 2 years later, and Night Dive are back at it again with the remaster for Quake 2, so let's see how they did. Presentation-wise, this remaster is on par with the Quake 1 remaster thanks to its updated lighting, audio, and enemy models. I'm not going to go into the specifics of what exactly was changed and updated here compared to the original, because there's better videos out there for that, but all you need to know is that this remaster is a big upgrade over the original when it comes to presentation. Quake 2 was already a pretty nice looking game to begin with, so this new coat of paint is very welcome. They also completely redid all of the cinematics, and they look drastically better than before. Now let's get into some of the more interesting changes. AI is probably the biggest upgrade this remaster has to offer over the original. The AI in the original Quake 2 was good, and a big upgrade over Quake 1, but it definitely had some shortcomings. Enemies often looked pretty stiff whenever you were engaging them, and they weren't able to follow you super well. Thankfully, the AI has been drastically improved in this version of Quake 2. Enemies now engage you in a way that feels much more natural compared to before. For example, enemies can now shoot at you while they're moving, instead of just awkwardly standing around letting you strafe around them. The most noticeable change, though, is in how enemies interact with their environment. They're now able to leap from ledges and across chasms in order to reach you, which is a huge upgrade over how they acted in the original. This actually has a large impact on Quake 2's gameplay, given that you now have to account for where enemies are able to follow you from, kinda like the newer Doom games. The last thing I want to highlight from the remaster aspect of this game is something called the id Vault. This is a large collection of media from the development of Quake 2, including concept art, high-quality models, and even some playable demos. This is such a cool addition, and I really wish more companies these days would do stuff like this. Video game development is fascinating to me, so getting to read through all the stuff in here was pretty sweet. It takes you through pretty much the entire history of Quake 2, from how it started out, to mid-stage planning, and how they got to the final product. A lot of people probably don't care too much about this stuff, but I'm really glad they included this, and I also hope they include this in any future remasters they might do. Imagine if they released a demo of that cancelled Doom 4 game. Alright, that's the remaster aspect of it out of the way. Let's talk about Quake 2 now. Quake 2 is a divisive game to say the least, given it's the sequel to one of the most innovative games ever made. When discussing Quake 2, I think it's important to also talk about what this game is and what it is not. Let me explain. So in case you didn't know, Quake 2 was never actually supposed to be Quake 2. It was originally going to be a brand new IP for id called War that was completely unrelated to Quake. One thing led to another during development, and they couldn't come up with a good name or a good way to market it, so they eventually just settled on calling it Quake 2. That information is really important when going into Quake 2, because it now allows us to evaluate it not as a sequel to Quake, but more as its own thing. These two games may look like they're related to one another, but aside from the name and the fact that you play as a dude that can run fast in both, they're very different. Let's start with the story first. As I mentioned earlier, Quake 2 is not a sequel to its predecessor. Instead, Quake 2 has an entirely new story. It is set far in the future where mankind is currently at war with a species called the Strogg, a cybernetic alien race made up of flesh and metal. A plan is made to counterattack the enemy on their homeworld known as Strogos. During entry, though, an enemy weapon called the Big Gun shoots down most of the Marines joining you on your mission. You are now miles away from your primary objective. Get there by any means necessary, and take out the Strogg leader, completing secondary objectives along the way. So obviously the story of Quake 2 isn't anything to write home about, but it's nice to have at least some context for what's going on. The Strogg is a pretty cool foe, especially given what they do to their enemies. You will often find captured Marines on your journey begging to be killed due to how much torture they are put through, where they will eventually end up as Strogg themselves. You also get intermission updates after you complete an objective in the form of these cutscenes, as well as in-game objective notifications. This ties into the progression of Quake 2. In Quake 1, you had a level-based structure where you would start a mission, get to the end, and then move on to the next one. Quake 2 is very different to this. Here you have objectives that you need to complete in order to progress, and this involves going back and forth between levels in order to move the campaign forward. I really like this, because it helps levels flow into each other much more naturally than how it worked in Quake 1, where every level was its own thing. The downside to this, though, is that it was often really easy to get lost in these levels, because you either didn't know where you were supposed to be going, or what item you needed. That brings me to something else that was added in this remaster, and that's this item called the Compass. The Compass is an item that you are given right away, and you can use it whenever you want to help you find where you should currently be heading by placing a path on the ground. This is a great addition, because it means that you will never spend minutes just wandering around like you had to in the past. The item system in general is a pretty cool feature that Quake 2 had. It allows you to save specific items like the quad damage or the dive suit for when you actually need them, instead of just having to use them whenever you find them like in Quake 1 or Doom. Aside from that, the general gameplay and combat of Quake 2 is pretty similar to Quake 1. You've still got a huge array of weapons to use against your enemies, and you've still got your fun movement tricks like bunny hopping and rocket jumping. One notable mention is that this is the game that gave us the iconic railgun and BFG. There's also a much wider range of enemies that you'll be facing, and they all have multiple different attacks that they will use on you. One thing I've never liked about Quake 2, though, is its extreme reliance on hit-scan enemies. If you don't know what hit-scan means, it's basically a mechanic that checks where you are in relation to an enemy, and if you're in their line of sight when they do a specific attack, you will take damage regardless of how fast you're moving. What I like about Quake 1's combat so much is that you're able to move around enemies and avoid their projectiles. In Quake 2, though, you will often have to resort to going in and out of cover to shoot enemies because you just simply can't avoid a lot of their attacks. This isn't an issue on the lower difficulties, because you can kinda just take the damage and move on, but this really becomes a problem on higher difficulties when enemies are able to completely shred your health in just a few hits. Not all enemies are like this, though. You still get plenty of opportunities to strafe around enemies insanely fast, and this is when Quake 2 is really at its peak. The atmosphere is the last thing I want to go over, because it's the most noticeable difference when coming here from its predecessor. Quake 1 excelled in this department thanks to its Cthulhu-inspired art style and moody soundtrack, creating a truly atmospheric experience. Quake 2 completely does away with that in favor of a more traditional shooter atmosphere with a much different art style and soundtrack. Quake 2's art style is much more realistic and grounded compared to its predecessor, generally taking place in or around enemy outposts. The developers do a good job of making you feel like you're in a war on an alien planet. They especially take full advantage of the sky, often showing jets flying by in the distance. Same goes for the soundtrack. Quake 2's soundtrack was composed by Sonic Mayhem and features a wide range of tracks ranging from heavy metal to hard rock. This type of music wouldn't fit well in Quake 1 if you ask me, because that game is all about taking in your surroundings and looking for secrets. Quake 2 on the other hand is pretty much constant action from start to finish though, and this new music choice reflects that very well. All in all, I prefer the atmosphere of Quake 1 over 2, but 2 still has a very memorable style and sound that is sure to stay with you for a very long time. At the time of its release, Quake 2's multiplayer continued to revolutionize the online shooter market thanks to its fast-paced, easy-to-pick-up gameplay and rapidly expanding esports scene. Once you actually get into it though, Quake 2's multiplayer is very similar to Quake 1's. It's the same frantic action that made the original so great and memorable, along with all of Quake 2's unique weapons and maps. It was super fun back then, and it's no different today. And hey, it doesn't ask you to buy a battle pass after each match, so that's nice. In May of 1998, Quake 2 received its first official mission pack, The Reckoning, developed by Xatrix. Unlike in Quake 1, Quake 2's mission packs are not direct sequels to the base campaign. Instead, you play as a different soldier tasked with a different set of objectives. In The Reckoning's case, you take control as Joker, whose squad has been tasked with infiltrating the Strogg's moon base and destroying their fleet. Getting into the gameplay, and it's more Quake 2. There's some new enemies to fight and some new weapons to use, but this really isn't a super interesting expansion. I've always considered this to be the worst Quake expansion because of its level design and color palette. The level design isn't bad or anything, it's just not anything we haven't already seen in Quake 2 before, and almost every level here is either vegetable oil yellow or brown, making it boring to look at. It's definitely not a bad expansion. If you liked Quake 2 and want more, you'll like this, but it's nothing to write home about. 6 months later in November, the second official expansion pack for Quake 2 was released. Ground Zero, developed by Rogue Entertainment, the same guys that made Quake 1's second expansion. The story is again extremely minimal. The Strogg has a machine called the Gravity Well, which is preventing Allied ships from leaving the planet's orbit. You must make your way there and destroy it in order to escape the planet. The gameplay and level design is where Ground Zero starts to get interesting. Visually, Ground Zero is actually quite a big step up from Quake 2 and its first expansion. It features larger areas with much more interconnected level design compared to what was present in the previous content. Of course, you're still doing all the same stuff that you're used to up to this point, like collecting items, completing objectives, and blasting your way through hundreds of enemies, but you're doing it all in a new environment, which is nice. The new enemies and weapons are all great additions too, so not too much to say there. Well, almost all of them. For some reason, they added this new enemy in this expansion called the Turret, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's literally just a turret that's placed all over walls and on ceilings to shoot at you. This enemy sucks. All it does is make you take your aim off of all the other enemies on the ground for a couple seconds. It's not even dangerous, its attacks are incredibly easy to avoid, it's just a thing that makes you waste your ammo. Minor complaint out of the way though, and Ground Zero is a fitting expansion to Quake 2's trilogy of content. Alright, moving on to the last piece of content related to the original Quake 2. Quake 2 64. Now Quake 1 also got an N64 port, but it was just Quake 1 with a lot of cut content and some cool lighting. Quake 2 64, on the other hand, is an entirely different game with a completely original campaign. Think of this like Doom 64, but for Quake. Of course there are some cutbacks though, levels are extremely short with a lot less enemies in them compared to normal Quake 2. This change had to be made to compensate for the weak capabilities of the N64 compared to a good PC at the time. Plus, come on, you literally had to use this thing to control your character, so you probably wouldn't want dozens of enemies on the screen at the same time anyway. It's also got something that Quake 2 on PC didn't even have, some nice end-screen animations which really helped this version stand out. This version doesn't have any new weapons or enemies unfortunately, but it still makes great use of what was present in Quake 2. I really like this version of Quake 2, more than both of the expansions in fact. It's just so nice having a bite-sized game that you can beat in an hour or two. The final piece of content included in the Quake 2 remaster is also the most exciting. If you weren't aware, the Quake 1 remaster included both the 20th anniversary expansion by Machine Games, as well as a brand new one, and they were both amazing. Now for the Quake 2 remaster, the folks at Machine Games have created a brand new, completely original expansion called Call of the Machine, and it is incredible. I don't even know where to start with this. Visually, it looks like a completely different game. I mean, obviously this isn't the original Quake 2 engine, but it's so weird seeing something that looks this good, yet still looks like it belongs in Quake 2. The levels are absolutely huge, way beyond anything from any of the content we've previously looked at. The amount of enemies in these levels is also unbelievable for Quake 2. I started this right after finishing Quake 2 64 with zero expectations going in, and I was just amazed at the number of enemies they make you fight at once. You literally fight more enemies in one encounter of this than in like 5 Quake 2 64 levels combined. It has 7 levels in total, with each being like a mini-campaign, because you don't keep any of your weapons or items from a level. It's also very non-linear, because you can complete each level in any order that you want. Each level has multiple boss fights in it, and some of them are insane. It's even got this cool Halo ODST style drop pod intro before each level. I honestly cannot believe that this is included for free. I would have gladly paid like 10 to 15 bucks for just this alone. It's the best content in the Quake 2 remaster, and it's one of the best retro shooters released in the last full years, period. So that's the Quake 2 remaster. What a game, and what a release. Our industry has a real problem right now of taking an old game and doing zero or very little changes to it, and then selling it for a ridiculously high price. Quake 1 and Quake 2 stand in stark contrast to this, being some of the best and most consumer-friendly releases that you can find right now. As far as I'm concerned, this is the gold standard for bringing an old game to modern platforms, and I hope more developers do the same. Thanks for watching, and have a good one.